Welcome to the annual Academic Excellence Showcase. Woo woo! We have a packed plenary session for you this morning, so I'm going to hand it off to President Peters.
Good morning, everyone. Good to see everybody here. So I just want to bring a few words of greeting and just kind of remind us what an important event this is, this Academic Excellence Showcase. We have 125 plus people actively participating, and we have over 30 faculty mentors involved in this year's Academic Excellence Showcase. And I do think it reminds us that no matter what occurs on a university or college campus, our primary focus here really is to educate our students. And so this is an opportunity where we can come together and engage in all of the incredible work that they are involved in as they are on their route towards their academic goals. So it's great to see a turnout like this. You're going to have some great faculty speakers from our own faculty. And then Cheyanne was also going to give us a great talk today as well. So really excited to be here and welcome you all. Have a great day. There'll be posters downstairs to review as well and other activities throughout the day. So looking forward to it. Thanks.
Good morning. I'm Jacqueline Kairos Hurley. I'm faculty in the College of Education, the Division of Education and Leadership. And I'm going to talk to you today about a project that I've been working on with the Center for Teaching and Learning. The title of my presentation is Integrating Culturally Sustaining Practices with Instructional Design Strategies for Higher Education Faculty. And we'll define all those fun words for you in a minute. But first, we're going to talk today, all of us, about community responsive research. And to me, community responsive research speaks to inclusive participation in the research process. So we're not doing research on communities, but we're doing research with communities. In education, that sounds a lot like participatory action research. It also sounds like praxis, which is this idea of having action or reflection in order to make change, right? So we're not just identifying barriers and problems, but we're actually seeking solutions and transformations in our communities. The Center for Teaching and Learning has some sustainability goals. Objective 3 is thinking through how to diversify and decolonize the curriculum. And Shell Batchelor approached me last year to think through what that could possibly look like and sound like in the real world. So our research question today is simply, how do we diversify and decolonize the curriculum? What does that mean beyond a metaphor for decolonization? The problem that I think exists is that we have to think through, and this is what I pose to our faculty, is we hear a lot of deficit thinking around whether or not kids these days are prepared for higher education. And an alternative to that is to think through, are we preparing students for a world that doesn't exist? Or are we preparing them in the same way that I was prepared 25 years ago, or the same way that we've been preparing kids since the inception of our university in the 1800s, right? So kids these days, they learn, they think differently, and then we all have these cultural ways of knowing, being, thinking, learning, and doing. So how can our university reflect that a little bit more in our pedagogy? So our purpose with this project is to create a professional learning community where we take up culturally sustainability as a stance and also thinking through trans-language pedagogy. And again, our process is equity coaching. And so we're doing this collectively. We're taking into consideration things like psychological safety and our reasons and also our barriers for doing this work. And essentially, we're engaging a core group of faculty in this thing called praxis. All right, let's define culturally sustaining pedagogy. Thumbs up if you've heard it. Yeah, especially those of you in my cohort, right? That was a good test. So culturally sustaining pedagogy, if nothing else, it's a stance. It's just a stance that you take when you plan instruction. So rather than those deficit ideologies or that deficit thinking, we're thinking about how to take into consideration what our students are coming to us with and planning instruction around that. So one clear example is thinking about language. We can do a lot to remediate what we think are perceived language deficits, either in terms of access to standard American English or English as a linguistic system in general. We can do that, or we can take into consideration all of our students' linguistic resources and plan instruction so that they can use all of their linguistic resources, and that we could have multilingualism as academic language. So cultural and linguistic sustaining pedagogy, I guess the opposite of that might be subtractive schooling, what Angela Valenzuela calls subtractive schooling, where I need to remediate you for some perceived deficit, and then you end up exiting without like your ability to speak your heritage language, right? Because we've taught you standard American English ad nauseum, and we've essentially removed one of your language systems. That's subtractive in nature. So culturally sustaining pedagogy is exactly as it sounds. We want to sustain the assets and the resources that you bring to the table and use them as tools and vehicles for learning. There's a couple of things that will help us do that, one of which is active learning. Active learning will allow students to show up as their authentic selves in the learning process. So getting away from that stand and deliver, getting away from the professor-centered style of lecture, and letting students engage in critical inquiry to interrogate problems that affect them, and be more socially responsible and socially active. And we're, as professors, giving them tools to do so. Translingual pedagogy is another thing that we're working on in this group. And again, that's similar to what I was talking about before with sustaining our linguistic assets and knowing that people have been using multiple languages for learning their whole lives. And so we can sustain that in a college environment and be able to use multiple languages when reading and writing and exploring our and sharing what we know as well. So this is what this project has looked like. We in winter term, we invited across campus anybody to participate in our first round of equity coaching. And we were hopeful that we would have like maybe 5 people sign up. And within minutes, I had 10. It was mind-blowing. I was so happy to see the level of engagement of people that want to know what culturally sustaining instruction is. And we created a hybrid professional learning community where we came together, we talked about some of these topics that I just introduced to you, and then we set off for a couple of weeks of exploration. And in a way, we sort of modeled the entire process. It was a strategy where we got to engage kind of inquiry style, where I presented information and then I watched as our faculty took it up in their own way. We also had opportunities for translanguaging, right? So I would present an article and we would use a tool like Perusal, and people could interactively read the article using whatever linguistic resources that they wanted. And people engaged for weeks 3 to 6 of this term on all this material. And then we met in week 7 to kind of debrief it and to talk about, well, what did this mean for you? What is this going to look like for you in your setting? And then currently, right now, everybody's working on making some sort of transformation. And we'll have our own internal showcase we decided in week 11 worked a little bit better for everybody. So we will have about 9 or 10 transformations, and also was really interesting is the representation across programs. So very involved. And that's it. So thank you and acknowledgement. These are the core group of faculty that signed up to work with this initial cohort. In our next meeting, we will talk about how we can transform this process so that it's more accessible and inclusive to everybody so that we could do this with future cohorts. So this is also my plug to invite you to work with me and play in the sandbox next year.
Hey, I'm Ryan, Dr. Ryan Topper in the English department. Today, I will briefly introduce the argument of the book I've been writing for my 4 years of teaching literature here at WU. And very briefly, 5 to 7 minutes, 300-page book in 5 minutes. So here we go. It's currently in peer review at a university press, fingers crossed, waiting for second reviewer. In it, I analyze how post-colonial African writers blend indigenous knowledge systems with modernist literary experimentation to craft strategic responses to cultural trauma. While canonical trauma theory focuses on the individual, the human, and the living, many post-colonial African writers, I argue, propose a theory of trauma that's transpersonal, trans-species, and trans-temporal. In short, what I'm calling an animist revision of psychoanalytic trauma theory. I'll briefly define these terms and offer a few examples along the way. Trauma theory is a highly debated discourse in 20th, 21st century global Anglophone literary criticism. On the one hand, trauma saturates the corpus. Novelists, playwrights, and poets grapple with the legacies of colonization, enslavement, war, genocide, and racism. However, many critics have argued that traditional trauma theory is too rooted in Western experiences to make sense of the everyday traumas of the post-colonial world. This critique is widely accepted, but literary scholarship on non-Western frameworks of trauma is still lacking. So taking this problem as a point of departure, my project began with my doctoral research with a question: what sort of understanding of collective trauma and survival is intrinsic to post-colonial African literature? Oddly enough, this question led me to the spirit world. Now, all of these books and many, many more conceptualize trauma and survival by creatively engaging with indigenous concepts surrounding the spirit world. During the heyday of post-colonial studies, scholars tended to ignore spiritual questions in favor of a certain historical materialism. Recently, however, a number of Africanists have brought spiritual life to the forefront of debates in literary criticism by way of animism, blurring boundaries between people and things, human and animal, living and dead, and other binaries central to our post-Enlightenment European humanism. Animist cosmologies invest all of these categories with spirit, with agency, and place them in mutual animation. Wole Soyinka, the first African writer to win the Nobel Prize in Literature, terms this tactic the animist interfusion of all matter and consciousness, and places it at the core of what he calls the African worldview. This interfusion, or re-enchantment of the world, as Nigerian poet Harry Garuba puts it, reframes how trauma should be approached in post-colonial literature. In short, animism radically decenters the assumed subject of trauma theory. From Freud onwards, trauma theory has presupposed an individual bordered subject whose consciousness becomes breached by external stimuli. But I've found that the animist cosmologies common in post-colonial African literature assume a subjectivity spread across various life forms. This difference necessitates a paradigm shift. If traditional trauma theory focuses on the individual, human, and living, and animist trauma theory, explicated from post-colonial literature, focuses instead on the transpersonal, the transspecies, and the transtemporal. I'll briefly explain these categories through some very brief literary examples. Transpersonal. Yvonne Vere's The Stone Virgins. In this novel, we have two sisters in the newly independent Zimbabwe. They're attacked by a dissident soldier. When one is decapitated, the other raped. Vera narrates this passage in the language of indigenous spirit possession, often blending characters together as the same subject in a way that's reminiscent of the modernism of Wolff or Picasso. Quote, "She feels him inside her body, near. He is as close as her own tongue, as close as her arms are to her body, her hair on her skin, close like her heartbeat. His breathing is her breathing." During this finely practiced dance of possession, as the narrator calls it, the sisters blend like tendril on a hard rock. Now, this phrase casts the sisters as one and the same with the sacrificial virgins depicted in the ancient cavern paintings referenced in the novel's title. Two sisters raped and mutilated during the Gukurahundi massacres of 1980s Zimbabwe, and two ancient sand virgins sacrificed to their leader depicted on a cavern wall. Vera writes in a way where these blend together, trauma as a possession dance that's not individual, but transpersonal, connecting animism, I would argue, to her form of African feminism. Transspecies. The protagonist and narrator of Amos Tutuola's The Palm Wine Drinkard and My Life in the Bush of Ghosts is always undergoing metamorphosis. He morphs into elements, natural phenomenon, creatures, air, rain, a stick. In one passage, he transforms into a monkey, lion, horse, camel, cow, then back into human, all in 2 sentences. Tutuola's wild modernist prose in this way blends with Yoruba folklore, envisioning a subject that's not only human, but trans-species, implicating all of the natural world. We should also recall that the earth itself inherits Okonkwo's curse at the end of Achebe's Things Fall Apart, the most famous African novel, passing on a collective need for, quote, sacrifices to cleanse the desecrated land. So indeed, an animist trauma theory implies an ecological shift, a shift away from the individual and the solely human that theorists of trauma often assume. Transtemporal. Many scholars speak of intergenerational trauma, and while this concept is useful, it also solely focuses on how the living inherit trauma, not how the dead might experience it. In Jarrett Mackley's Moses, Citizen, and Me, Citizen, a child soldier in the Sierra Leonean Civil War, murders his grandmother, and like Vera, Jarrett Mackley describes Citizen's traumatic flashbacks in the language of indigenous spirit possession. During these possessions, the voice of Citizen's grandmother begins to call out to him. The novel in this way casts trauma as implicating the living and the dead together. Later in the novel, ancestral spirits join Citizen in a healing ritual, demonstrating a transtemporal interconnectedness between the past and the present, which Jarrett Mackley pulls from Mende cosmology in West Africa. Now, these are just 3 very brief examples. In the book, I analyze many more: poetry, drama, fiction across Anglophone Africa, using these texts to revise concepts foundational to psychoanalytic trauma theory and cultural memory studies. In sum, much of post-colonial African literature theorizes trauma beyond the paradigm of the individual, the bordered Cartesian subject that we in Euro-American academia assume is natural. Indeed, reconnecting with a subjectivity spread across various life forms is central to what I describe in my book as post-colonial African literature's animist poetics, an aesthetic logic functioning as a strategic response to the traumas of colonial modernity. Thanks.
So the title of my talk is Unhoused and Dehumanized, Community Responsive Research. Now, there was a phase in time where it was popular to say it in 6. And this means that you're supposed to describe yourself in 6 words. So this was going on when I was in graduate school, and one year when I was at a departmental meeting, we all had to say it in 6. And the first thing that popped to my mind was this: why am I not homeless too? But I was too embarrassed to utter that out loud. I thought, who am I, privileged white woman in graduate school, to say this? But in reality, there's privileges, there's also hardships that are unseen, and I still could experience this. And many of us can experience this as well because of things like job loss, continued unemployment, loss of social support, loss of family members, or debt, continued illness. And actually, a lot of us face this in Oregon, the state of homelessness. We have one of the higher rates in the country of homelessness in the state of Oregon. Now, with this status of being unhoused is also stigma, and oftentimes dehumanization as well. So what I study is investigating this from a psychological perspective, and it's how I integrate community responsive research. Now, homelessness is complex and multifaceted, but one piece of it is how we view certain groups of people as less than human. And this creates psychological barriers so that policies fall through, services can go unsupported. So I study how to overcome some of these dehumanizing biases and support more dehumanized groups. Again, because of the structural issues, any of us could find ourselves without a place to sleep at night. Now, besides the perceptions of homelessness, one of the greatest issues faced by unhoused people is simply a lack of affordable housing. And this really impacts us in Oregon as well. We're one of the states that has the least amount of affordable housing, let alone housing in general, for anyone looking for housing in comparison to our population numbers. Now, some of this response to affordable housing and the lack of affordable housing is our perceptions about it. And we see this tension both locally and nationally. We see it in changing policies about encampments in Portland, also the case that has been brought before the Supreme Court out of Grants Pass. So this is something that is prominent in all of our communities. But what I want you to consider is, for you personally, have you ever felt like you were treated less than compared to others? Were you ever excluded because you weren't from the right place? You weren't born in the right place? Maybe you didn't go to the right school. Maybe you don't have the right heritage or the right skin color. Maybe you don't sleep in the right place. These are snippets of facing stigma that then can converge into dehumanization. We know that there are certain groups in Western countries like the US that are frequently dehumanized. When people view or interacting people from these outgroups, there are certain pathways in the brain that don't light up as recognizing humanity, and instead disgust pathways light up in what researchers call dehumanization. And being unhoused is one of these groups. Now, when we see another person as less than, as having less human nature, lacking in human uniqueness, having less human essence, this is what we think of as dehumanization, when certain groups and people are seen as less than human without dignity. And I hear this dehumanization occurring when I hear jokes about the encampments in Portland, or no one has a house in Portland. Again, that's related to the affordable housing issue. Or I can hear and witness dehumanization when there's a bristling, when people are walking by tents under bridges in our cities. Now, dehumanization is part of coping mechanisms that we use when we're facing things that are unfamiliar and things that we fear. But it's also an unconscious psychological leap that's associated with violence and extreme atrocities. Now, on a smaller scale, it's also related to less helping behaviors and less support, poor treatment, and social isolation for those who are targets of dehumanization. And really, it's a psychological barrier that can impact policies and services of those that we view as deserving versus undeserving. Public perception shapes politics. And when these perceptions include dehumanization, it's hard to have effective policies and services that are successful for those who are frequently dehumanized. So in my question of why am I not homeless too, and in my response to seeing this in communities and around us, I have been really concluding a study that looks at dehumanization of people who are unhoused. And I have had about 400 participants in the study, and I looked at how people view unhoused populations and people, and looked at how much dehumanization occurred. And something else that I've been interested in is if there are things that we can do to lessen dehumanization. And what I've looked at specifically is empathy. And in my results, what I have found is that empathy does lessen dehumanization if you prompt people to be more empathetic, to consider empathy with certain outgroups. But what I found was that it lessens dehumanization for unhoused teens in particular. and it does not lessen dehumanization for unhoused adults. And I've also found that there's more dehumanization against unhoused adults. And so there's something intersecting about aging and being unhoused that I hope to explore further. And then I also hope to look into more interventions, possibly empathy interventions that can be leveraged to help homeless youth and people who are working with unhoused youth or creating policies for unhoused youth. A successful response to homelessness must see unhoused people as fully human. Take, for example, a quote from a New York Times piece on homelessness that describes Matthew, who had a permanent job, then lost his permanent job, had several odd jobs, and so was living in a van, but then he lost his parents, and so then he also lost his van. So then he began sleeping in public places. He says, "I remember strangers helping me with eye contact and a smile and saying, 'Hey, it's gonna get better. You can survive this.' That was probably as important as getting food, just human contact." So public perception shapes social stagnation as well as change, and we can shift views to support more effective policies and services that embrace all people as fully human. Now, when I talk about dehumanized groups, and I'm talking specifically about unhoused people, I don't want that to take away from all of the dehumanized groups that are out there, and that shouldn't belittle any of the devastating negative consequences that are being outplayed for all of these different dehumanized groups. So today, my say it in 6 is, we're all fully, beautifully human. Thank you. We're now going to have our keynote speaker come forward. Cheyanne Heidt is a proud member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, who currently resides in Willamina with her 2 daughters and husband, Tyler. As the curriculum specialist for her tribe, she is dedicated to preserving and sharing her cultural heritage with future generations. In her free time, Cheyanne loves getting lost in a good book, traveling to new and exciting places, taking trips to Disneyland, and embarking on outdoor adventures. Cheyanne is a passionate advocate for education and Indigenous rights, using her platform to inspire and empower others to embrace their heritage and traditions. So welcome, Cheyanne.
So my name is Cheyanne. I do serve as the curriculum specialist for the tribe, which is, for any of you that don't know, about a 45-minute drive from here if you're headed towards the coast. So I was invited to speak here today, and it was kind of left up to me what I wanted to talk about. I knew the theme for this academic excellence showcase, and I knew it was really community-based, and so I spent a couple weeks kind of sitting on this and trying to figure out what I wanted to talk about. And as I heard our 3 previous speakers speak, my brain was like, oh, I could have went like 75 directions with this topic, because you talk about culture, you talk about trauma, and you talk about dehumanization, and there's a lot of that that's rooted in Native history, right? But I'm gonna keep going with what I planned, because I promise it's good too. And what I am hoping to share with you all today is kind of my journey and the journey that we're really working to empower our youth towards, in the idea that every person has a role in their community. And that role looks different, but every person has a place, right? And has something that they can contribute. So I'm gonna, I have a couple of slides here I'm going to go through with you all, but you're going to get to hear a lot about kind of the journey that I went through in finding my role in community, and then some strategies that we share with a lot of our youth out at the tribe for how to feel confident in their role. So as it was said in my introduction, I am a tribal member. So I'm an enrolled member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. I believe I was enrolled around 6 months old. It's all I've ever known. My family has deep roots in the community, both sides of my family. My dad's parents moved up here. They were, and I say this with the utmost respect, 100% hippies. They moved up here from San Francisco, Palo Alto area in the early 1970s in a school bus and moved to Willamina. My grandpa built their house. So that side of my family comes deeply rooted in that. And then the tribal side of my family has lived here forever. We were fortunately one of the families that were able to stay in the area come termination. We had multiple family members that pooled money, bought plots of land, were able to buy homes. So we were fortunate enough that we did not have to relocate when those services were cut off to Grand Ronde. And because of that, it has definitely helped us feel more secure in our position in our place, right? And so deep roots in my community, a deep passion for the Willamina, Grand Ronde, and surrounding areas. I was a Willamina student, K-12, go Bulldogs, and loved my time in the school district. My dad is a high school history teacher, my dad doesn't teach history. My dad teaches biology. That's a very different mindset. He is a high school biology teacher and PE teacher / wrestling coach / weight training teacher because it's a small school, so we wear 75 different hats. And my mom has worked out at the tribe my entire life, first in our tribal court as the court administrator, and she is now our education department manager. So I don't think it came as a surprise to anybody that I would find my way into a spot that blended education and the tribe. It's where I grew up, right? I was either up at the school with dad or out at the tribe with mom. So I was really happy to be able to find this position. I started off kind of my journey after high school, 100% certain that I was going to be an elementary teacher. I loved working with kids. I had worked in a lot of our elementary classrooms throughout high school. I had a really strong drive to find a way to teach kids more about tribal people in a way that was present tense. Right? So they're learning that Native people still exist today, and in a way that was, normalizing, right? So we're using full color images. We're talking about their presence in the world that they are in right now, right? It's not past tense. It's not 500 years ago. It's not foreign or exotic, right? It's the way that life is as it surrounds us. And so I'd kind of discovered that after working in some of those elementary classrooms. I headed down to Oregon State, started on that mission to become an elementary educator, did my student teaching year, worked with fourth graders, absolutely loved them. And then I started realizing towards the end of my undergrad that it was not normal to like to make lesson plans. Because I really liked writing lesson plans and nobody else did in my cohort. So it was kind of suggested to me, like, maybe you look at curriculum, right? It's amazing that you want to go in and make this change in the classroom, but what if you helped create curriculum that could make change in hundreds of classrooms, right? So that led me to here, and I did my graduate school here at Western right during that wonderful 2019-2020 prime time in education. Did my graduate program, focused highly on culturally responsive teaching. So if you saw me during the first presentation today, I was like frantically taking notes about like things I could incorporate. Loved the idea that we can teach kids in a way that matches who they are, right? That's what culturally responsive teaching is to me, is you're teaching these students in the way that their culture is, and we're matching that for them so that they can see relevancy in what they're learning. So that was kind of my drive, my graduate program. Then the world turned to chaos after that. COVID hit. I had my daughter in April 2nd of 2020. So not only was I adjusting to this crazy COVID world, but I was also adjusting to being a new mom. And then to top it all off, my husband got into grad school in Montana. So we moved in June to Montana. So that first year and a half, kind of right around there, where the world's trying to figure itself out, I'm trying to figure me out, and this tiny human out. I really didn't know where all of my education was going to lead me. And I felt really uncertain in that. I didn't want to and wasn't able to go teach, right? I knew he'd only be in grad school for a year or two, didn't want to establish myself in a school, had a daughter at home that I was not sending to daycare, right, for fear of all the things that could happen to her with COVID. Was away from my home for the first time ever. Even when I was in Corvallis, right, I was an hour drive from home. I drove back, I got to hang out with family. So I called my mom and I was like, I'm not using my brain. I'm just sitting here. I don't know. I went through all of this schooling and now I'm just here and I don't know what to do. And so I ended up taking a position with our tribe to be an academic coach. Worked with kids as a tutor online through COVID, and eventually then the position of the curriculum specialist came open. I applied and I didn't get it, and I was really sad. And again, I called my mom and I was like, what was all those years of school for? And she was like, it'll come, you'll find your spot, right? 6 months later, there was a reorganization at the tribe. The curriculum specialist moved into a new position, and I was then hired in. She actually was my boss, so that was extra funny. But it was all in that process of finding my role, right? And I kept having to just believe that I had a role somewhere, somehow, in education, in my tribe. And so now I do everything I can to fully take on that role. I found this quote and I really like it. Ties nicely with the ways that we think of community relations and community involvement within the tribe. So I alone cannot change the world, but I can cast a stone in the waters to create many ripples. So at the tribe and in kind of tribal philosophy really as a whole, we talk a lot about the concept of 7 generations and planning for 7 generations ahead. So everything I do right now is with the intent that in 7 generations from now, the world will look different. The world will look better for them. I start with my daughters. I have 2 little girls. And a lot of what I do centers around the idea that when they go into school, I want them to learn about their tribe. I want them to learn that tribal people are here. I want them to feel recognized and not tokenized. And I want them to learn about their history of this place as it relates to them, because those were things that didn't happen when I was in school. Now, my hope is that change, right, is going to ripple on for 7 generations and only get stronger. So I wanted to share this all with you because it's that idea that maybe what you're doing right now doesn't seem extremely important, but if you're causing ripples, if you're creating change, no matter how small it is, it could have a huge impact later on. So, the power of community. What is community? This is something I had to figure out in kind of all of my journey through education and moving and being away from family and then coming back to family, right? So community can have so many different defining lines. It can be your geography, right? So we have the community of the tribe as it sits within its borders. We have the larger community that includes Willamina, which is our local town or our nearest town, and the school district a lot of our kids attend. You have shared interest community, right? So hashtag readers unite, right? People that read books, that would be a community of shared interests. Social network, right? So who are you talking to every day? Who are you socializing with? Cultural community, virtual community, inclusive community, self-defined community, right? All those ways that we construct community can be loose, right? You can create a community out of anybody. For us, when we look at our tribal community, we're looking at the community as it sits within this geography. We're looking at the community as it sits within our tribal membership, right? We're looking at the community in which we sit as the tribal membership and geography and all of our supporters and relationships and partners and allies, right? All of those pieces are different pieces of community. all of these ways that are listed here, and I'll let you just kind of look at them yourself, but those are all ways that we can contribute to community in itself. It can look different for everybody. It's something that you work towards, right? Maybe you don't figure it out right away. Maybe it changes over time. Growing up, I did not feel confident in my, identity as a Native person. My hair is pretty dark right now, but it was a lot lighter when I was a kid. And often what we refer to that as is like white passing, right? You look at me and you don't know I'm Native. That's not true for everybody, but it is true for a large majority of our tribal membership. We don't look like the books, the textbooks, the sepia images of Native people, right? We don't fit within that construct. And so with that, and then along with some kind of unknown unfamiliarity with culture and language and practices, right? I felt sometimes like a poser, right? Like a fraud. Like, am I really Native? Is that who I am? And I'm saying this as somebody who grew up going to powwows from the time I was born. My grandpa served on our tribal council for 21 years, starting the year I was born. So we were hugely involved in the political side of our family. I knew a lot about our history of our tribe, but I had a lot of stress, right, and anxiety and unknown about what it actually meant to be Native. So in high school, I accepted a position, was offered the opportunity to travel to New York City to participate in an internship that the tribe and the Museum of Natural History collaborate on together. The Museum of Natural History has the Willamette meteorite. I don't know if anybody has seen anything about it. It's not something we learned about as kids, but what it is in our community, it's called Tamanawas, which is how it's essentially like a spirit icon in Chinakwawa. And we travel there. The museum houses it for a whole long history of reasons that I won't even get into. But part of the agreement is they can have it there as long as we have this partnership. And I was accepted to go on the internship along with one of my peers who I had grown up with my whole life, but who I viewed as very Native, right? She was who I thought was like what it looked like to be Native. She spoke our languages. She knew our language. She knew our dances. She took part in all those ceremonies. And I was like, this is not going to go well. Like, everyone's going to know I'm a fraud. What do I even have to contribute to this? And we showed up to this internship. And they said, okay, we need you guys to create this presentation for our college interns, which is very scary when you're like 16 to have to speak to college kids. And we want you to tell them about the tribe. Teach them about the tribe, right? Like, they know why you're here. They know who you are. Now it's time to teach them. And I, again, panicked because I was like, she's going to know so much more than me. Like, I'm just going to let her take the lead on this. She was a very quiet person, so she was panicking for her own reasons, that she didn't want to have to speak out loud. And we looked at each other and they said, okay, we want you guys to cover history and government and language and practices and all these things, right? And we go to the history part and she looks at me and was like, this is all you. Like, I know pieces, I know bits of it, but like, I can't explain our tribal council. I can't explain that process, right? And I was like, well, I can explain that. Like, I can explain restoration and termination and like how our government is structured. And that's all I hear at family dinners. So I was like, I can explain that. And then we got to the language and the culture and the traditional practices piece. And I looked at her and was like, this one's all you. Like, I can't help with any of this. I don't know our language. I know some of our practices, but I don't know how to explain them. And I think it was in that trip, in that 3-week trip, that both her and I, but speaking for myself for sure, figured out that each person has a role, right? Because as our tribe sits, we're not going to move anywhere as a tribe if we only have people who know about our culture. Or if we only know people who know about our history, right? And funny enough, our offices are now across the door from each other. We're in the same hallway. And she is our language preservation specialist. And I go to her with lessons and curriculum, and I say, can you help me translate this and find ways to make it more culturally inclusive? And she comes to me and says, I have this idea for this lesson plan, but I need this information, and can you help me structure this so that it's a good lesson? And we each found our roles, right? It was a newfound respect for each other. It was this newfound idea that we each contribute to this tribe, but it looks very different. And there's no pressure for you to contribute the same way I do, or for me to contribute in the same way you do. Because if we do that, then we're not going to be great in our roles, right? So, moral of the story is find your ways that you can contribute. Find your ways that it feels good. Find the ways that you can give back, right? Even if it looks maybe a little non-traditional or doesn't fit with your construct of how you could contribute. So, where can you make a difference? I think this is the other thing that I realized over time is that there's not just one way to make a difference in a community, but it can be collective as a whole. Volunteering is obviously kind of that thing that pops into our mind first, right? When you think about community service or giving back to community, volunteering time. But it can also look like just participating, right? When there's an event in the community, go to it. I am not only benefiting myself and my own self-learning, but also the tribe as a whole, because I now go to language classes that Zoe, the girl I went to New York with, hosts every week, right? And so I'm participating in that, because if nobody participates, they can't do it anymore, right? But if people participate, that's a way that you're contributing to your community, just by going, right? Advocating, this is the way that we tell people outside of what we consider our tribal community that they can help support us and help support our community. Advocate on behalf of the tribe. Advocate for minorities, for Native kids, for, so many different little constructs, right? But advocating, meaning supporting us in ways by promoting our curriculum, by promoting our voice, by making it known that there are tribes here in Oregon with people who look just like you, right? Helping make that known in ways that we've released information for. And then just support, right? Sometimes it's enough to say, like, yes, I support you. I stand with the tribe. I support what the tribe does. I support the mission of them trying to bring Native youth into our, to throw terms out from previous presentations, colonized education settings, right? What does that look like? How can we support them? How can we help structure that? So these are all ways, right, that maybe are not just volunteering, which is the first thing that comes to mind, but the ways that we can provide and give back to our community. We can also take action and make an impact. So locate volunteer opportunities. If I'm speaking to this as in relation to just the tribe, there's always opportunities to volunteer out there. We have so many different programs. We have so many different areas that we reach to people that there's always opportunities for that, finding ways to contribute and give back. For me, my way of taking action was focused on my career. I knew that I was passionate enough and committed enough to what I wanted to do to make change to turn it into what I do every single day. And not everything I believe and want to help make change with, I feel that strongly about. But for implementing Native curriculum and teaching Native history, I turned it into my career. But I also had to think a little outside the box and what that was going to look like in my career journey. And then just speak out, right? When you see something wrong, say it, and that's okay. Say that this is not okay, or throw thoughts out there, right? Why am I not homeless, right? Throw those thoughts out there, speak them out loud to people, because if you only hold them in your head, they don't get shared. Action doesn't occur, right? We can't piggyback off of that. So brainstorming ideas and solutions, talking about those things that are maybe hard to talk about, right? Nobody felt super comfortable with me hopping up here and saying, yeah, Native history is full of trauma and dehumanization. That's uncomfortable. And out at the tribe, we make ourselves talk about that. Because if we don't, it just gets forgotten. And it's the message that I give to our teachers in our school, right? It's not fun to teach about genocide of Native people. It's not fun to teach about boarding schools. It's not fun to teach about termination or relocation or war, right? But if we don't talk about it, it has the chance to happen again, right? Because we don't use it as a teaching opportunity to teach kids like why we need to make that change. So speaking about it, talking about it, making those changes, and realizing that no matter where you are, no matter what role you sit in your community, or what ties up your time, or where you believe so strongly about, you do have the power to create change in every single space that you exist in. You just have to figure out what that looks like and where you want to do that. So thank you all. I hope that I didn't ramble on for too long, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Cheyanne. Let's actually give all of our speakers another round of applause. All right, I'm gonna make you clap one more time because we actually also need to thank the Pure Executive Board who put this amazing event as well as the entire day together. So thank you. Those of you in the room and out. Okay, so as we wrap up, I just encourage you to continue in the community of academic excellence showcase today. Thank you again for coming to our plenary.